Good day, colleagues and friends. Thank you for the opportunity to share ongoing research into the seaborne slave trade in North Carolina. This investigation was inspired by Dr. Dorothy Redford, who discovered that her ancestors came to Somerset Plantation in the Albemarle area aboard one of these ships. A total of 993 enslaved people was listed as entering North Carolina between the years of 1784 and 1790. The largest single source was Charleston and the West Indies, especially Jamaica. But of particular interest are the high number coming directly from Africa, mostly to Port Roanoke, serving plantations around the Albemarle Sound. So our research questions are: how did these consignments fit into the context of North Carolina's seaborne trade? Who were the captains? What was their presence in the slave trade? What were the geographic origins of the slaves in Africa? And what are the current memories and narratives surrounding this trade and these events? There are a few secondary sources that discuss the North Carolina seaborne slave trade. One that stands out is the 1994 article by Walter Minchington that draws primarily on port records. The rest are a patchwork quilt of primary sources. These include newspapers, shipping news, advertisements, correspondence from North Carolina and New England, and even political figures like Jonathan Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Beginning in the colonial period, North Carolina's ports of entry were settlements where a vessel's cargo could be checked by a government inspector and import fees collected. These ports were essential elements in developing the early commerce of the colony. Port records in the North Carolina State Archives contain a wealth of information about the date of entry, incoming and outgoing cargoes, captains, masters, owners of the ship. And this starts in 1682 and continues to 1788. This is the entry showing the Camden with a cargo of Africans. I visited the archives with Dr. Redford, and it was quite moving to see the entry for the first time. Port Roanoke was located in southern Chowan County at the north end of Edenton Bay, just north of the confluence of the Chowan and the Roanoke River, which formed the Albemarle Sound. It was named Edenton and incorporated in 1722 in honor of Governor Charles Eden, who died that year. And this map shows the details like the wharves where the enslaved cargoes would have disembarked and the courthouse where auctions or business transactions took place at that time. The cargo of Africans and African Americans in 1786 and 1787 coincides with the need for labor of the Lake Company's project to dig a 6-mile-long canal, 4 to 6 feet in depth, connecting Lake Phelps to the Scuppernong River, which flowed into the Sound. Prominent businessmen Nathaniel Allen, Samuel Dickinson, and Josiah Collins Sr. of Somerset Plantation believed the canal would serve a crucial irrigation and transportation system need in North Carolina. It was actually an initiative that was fraught with taxation arguments and complications in constructing the canal that ran through neighboring agricultural properties. In 1816, Collins filed an equity suit against his neighbors, and finally he bought the property out from all his planters and partners, including, most likely, the enslaved Africans. But slave labor was considered critical to the success of this initiative. Several consignments of slaves arrived just prior to the start of this project. 3 voyages are listed as arriving directly from Africa. 2 by the vessel Camden with Captain Richard Grinnell, and 1 with Captain Thomas Brattle. And these are the 2 voyages that we were particularly interested in finding out more about. The 2 African voyages were coordinated by General Assembly members who were also slave owners and consignment agents, namely Henry Hill and Thomas Fitz. They started the voyage at great expense in December 1785, shortly prior to a law that required a duty or penalty of £5 per slave from the coast of Africa. These two slave traders petitioned to be exonerated from the said penalty, but their request was denied. The lawmakers termed the importation of slaves into this state, being North Carolina, as a productive of evil consequence, but ultimately the law was repealed in 1790. The names of Thomas Foote and Henry Hill appear in the census records and the newspapers of North Carolina, listing runaway slaves, property sales, and here you can see that Foote owned 13 slaves in the Edenton area during that time period. Port records show that the outgoing cargoes on both African voyages was exclusively casks of rum, fairly typical of that time period. New England boasted dozens of rum distilleries along the seaport towns like Newport. Richard Grinnell, like Brattle, served as a lieutenant in the Revolutionary War and in fact is referred to in John Adams' diary in 1778. He was imprisoned in London. He was a privateer captain who conducted reconnaissance missions around Brazil to capture a British whaling fleet. And in this piece of correspondence, which the American Philosophical Society staff helped us acquire, he is introduced to the slave trade in 1772 by Captain Draper Toman, who himself was introduced to the trade by Nathaniel Briggs. And it is equating him with the governors of the Cape Coast in Ghana as a new acquirement to the slave trade. The introduction that Richard Grinnell received was to the African Company of Merchants, a British chartered company on the Gold Coast of modern-day Ghana. And he was introduced to David Mill, governor of that coast, but also brother of James Mill, who ran a London-based slave trade company known as Ross and Mill. So often these governors had connections to agents in London who were frequently family members. And the consignments of Africans went mainly to ports such as Charleston, South Carolina, and Jamaica and the West Indies. And the Company of Merchants traded particularly with agents in the Ghana and the Guinea area at that time. The Rhode Island slave traders had a mentoring system. Firstly, Aaron Duarte Lopez was a very wealthy Portuguese Jewish merchant and philanthropist who owned numerous ships and hired many captains. He mentored Captain Nathaniel Briggs, who in turn mentored Captain Draper Toman, and then, as you saw in that last letter, finally Captain Richard Grinnell, and they often traveled and voyaged together on the same ship as apprentices, learning the slave trade and being introduced to the various European governors and African traders along the coastline before they were allowed to trade independently or on their own ships. The New England newspapers reveal that the Camden was a new vessel built in the last 3 years and fitted out for the transatlantic voyage, and this was listed as just prior to the second trip to Africa. At the time the Camden would have been acquiring the African consignment, a Charleston newspaper noted the presence of a vessel with that name off the island of St. Louis. This was a popular trade area in Senegal. It is an island off the port city of St. Louis, wedged between the two mouths of the Senegal River, and today this is listed as a World Heritage Site. Both Guerry Island, further south of Dakar, and Louis were renowned for the French-African mulatto powerful businesswomen who owned land and slaves themselves. They helped European men with trade and transactions at the time the Camden was on the coast, and I've listed two sources here that give further insights and depth of understanding of this slave trade arrangement. The slave ship Jeanette voyaged along the windward coast to Sierra Leone and Liberia to collect a consignment. Brattle's career in the slave trade began in the 1770s and continued to 1790s. He worked for the Vernon brothers, who's one of their agents who are well established in the Newport slave trade. In fact, they were one of the first agencies that sold enslaved peoples directly to the colonies, especially South Carolina, and took back rice to New England. The windward coast was also known as the grain coast for the growing of rice and wheat, but the locations such as Cape Mount were not always known to Europeans because there were no natural harbors, and often the trade was carried out at sea or at roadsteads because of the dangerous surf. So consequently, the ship captains did not always know the exact locations of their African customers' settlements. The custom was for bypassing ship to spot a settlement on the shore and then to fire a cannon to see if the locals were ready for trade. And if no African canoes appeared, the ship simply moved along the coastline. But the captains did elaborate on the smallness of these settlements at Cape Mount, apparently 3 small separate villages with about 50 or 60 people. But they moved along the coast, so ascertaining the exact location from one voyage to the next was often inaccurate, and the location of 17th century trading places based on toponomical similarity to a current place today does require some caution. Settlements moved from one place to another, often taking the name with them, and villages had no fixed point, especially if they were not European settlements or forts, and therefore not rooted to a specific spot. Bamboo structures were easily dismantled and moved and then rebuilt again. Captain Brattle appears in legal depositions in the collection of the Rhode Island Historical Society for his cruel punishments and unfair service contracts to his black seaman, Samuel Freebody, and the reports give vivid and somewhat unsettling descriptions of the beatings suspended from the shrouds of the vessel, followed by what they termed picklings in salted brine. What traces are there of heritage related to these 2 captains in the seaport town of Rhode Island? The Newport Restoration Foundation has a house museum known as the Jonathan Gibbs House, who appears not to have personally lived here, but rented out the property to who other than James Brattle, who lived here with 4 other people. Richard Grinnell, or so-called Pirate Dick in his family genealogies, was buried in Little Compton, where he retired, and his gravestone is visible in the local cemetery. There are numerous very colorful stories about his life as a pirate, but also a slave owner. He owned 2 slaves at the time of his death. He had 2 wives and a total of 12 children. But he was a fairly glamorous pirate, and there were a number of colorful stories about the curse of an Algerian princess on a white horse that followed him and appeared on the day of his death. In North Carolina, descendants of the enslaved community have discovered lists of names in the probate records of the Collins family. Visitors passing through North Carolina in the late 1800s recall and wrote extensively about the large number of enslaved so-called Guinea people on the Collins plantation brought to North Carolina by New Englander sea captains. The compilation of narratives and genealogies associated with the enslaved community at Summerton Place is rapidly growing with the dedication of descendants and new generations of researchers. Establishing connections to the larger context of the triangular trade may add complementary data sets. Following the slave ship routes and trade markets frequented by captains like Grinnell and Brattle reveal the new possibilities for ports of origin along the latter decades of the 1790s and, of course, the time period when these vessels were active. While coastal areas of Liberia, Ivory Coast, and Guinea were vast, it does seem likely that the larger ethnic groups contributing towards the Port Roanoke consignments in 1786 and 1787 came from these areas, including from the Senegambia area. Current genetic research has added new understandings of the connections to previously neglected areas of slave trading using 50,281 research participants combined with historical research shipping documents to better illustrate the genetic landscape of the Americas. One of the outcomes of the study was that the genetic correlation of the current populations to the African Americans to areas like Guinea, the Grain Coast, were well represented because of the higher mortality rates working in the rice fields of the plantations. And genetic connections may reveal arrival of enslaved people from specific areas of Africa at certain times and allow for regional comparisons and a more comprehensive understanding of their African roots. Many thanks to those who commented and contributed towards this research, including the descendants of the Somerset community, the assistance from the American Philosophical Society staff finding New England newspapers, and of course the Program of Maritime Studies in the History Department at East Carolina University. And thank you all for listening to this presentation today.